All right, AP World, we're going to take the video version to cover some more of this massive unit, um, kind of in different places between 6th and 7th period. So 6th period, you'll probably be able to skip a bit over. I think this is where we ran out of time in 7th period. So we were looking at some of the effects of the Great Depression there. For those areas of the world that were still under the control of Europeans, some of the colonies still out there, they end up getting hit hard by the Great Depression as well. As the Great Depression puts so many people out of work, it really is going to do quite a number on consumer demand for goods. And so that's going to have that trickle down effect that's going to reach the colonies. And so, there's not going to be the demand for the raw materials to run the factories to produce the goods because so many people are out of work. So many people are impacted by the economics of the Great Depression. Yeah. And so things are particularly bad in the colonies as a result of that. All right. In terms of digging out of the Great Depression, I mean, historically speaking, really, it's going to be World War II that will kind of more or less end the Depression. But there were moves being made in the right direction. Keynesian economics. Keynesian is a reference to Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist, and whose kind of thinking and kind of suggestions, advice, we're going to really kind of be a major influencer here with a lot of leaders in different parts of the world, including in the United States. He argues that the key to try to get out of the depression is that governments have to take direct control of their economy. And in countries like the United States, the British kind of adhere to this as well. Um, Usually government tries to kind of stay out and let business kind of do its own thing. And and Keynes is saying no. In a significant economic disaster like this, if the government doesn't step in and take direct control over the economy, the suffering isn't going to end. The conditions aren't going to change, and so he does talk about this idea of stepping in and increasing whatever that is, the government creating jobs. Deficit spending is a reference to the fact that the government needs to borrow money, whether it's borrowing money to pay people to put them to work. But the government needs to borrow money. That's what deficit spending is when you're borrowing more than the government makes through taxes, that kind of a thing. And Keynes says that you just borrow to try to work around this, and then once you recover the economics and things stabilize, then you can start paying all of that debt off. Franklin Roosevelt, who becomes the president of the United States shortly after the Great Depression starts, is a major adherent to Keynesian economics. And when he creates his New Deal in the United States, it is definitely following along with a lot of those principles that Maynard Keynes talks about, writes about. And well, you'll get more of this when you take some American history next year. But the New Deal really does embrace Keynesian economics, and we're not going to go into extreme detail on it, but it does follow these three themes of bringing relief to people who've been directly impacted by the depression, and then working on recovery, kind of getting the country, strengthening them up again. And then reform is just the idea of laws and regulations that are going to try to make sure that something like the Great Depression doesn't happen again. So those are kind of the goals of the New Deal. And then again, just leaning back on that those Keynesian principles. In Japan, they do initially also suffer some ill effects, economic effects from the Great Depression, but they are going to recover themselves a little bit more quickly, a little bit easier to do. I mean, smaller country, a little more homogeneous kind of a country, a little easier to work with than a big, lumbering nation like the United States. But what they're going to do is purposefully devalue their currency, and by doing that, in effect, it ends up stimulating exports, trade, and it puts Japan in a place where really by the early 1930s they're going to be positioned to start with a little bit more of their, well, I shouldn't even say a little bit, they're going to be starting to get aggressive as far as overseas expansion goes, and we'll get back into that later on to kind of give us some examples of exactly what the Japanese do. But their experience with the Depression definitely a far more short-term kind of impacts in Japan. Meanwhile, back in Russia, now the Soviet Union, I should say there, but before they become the Soviet Union, and shortly after that November 1917 revolution that put the communists in power, there is a major civil war that tears Russia apart. It's going to be a civil war. It's going to, like pretty much everything in Russia, it's going to end up with millions dying. And it pits the communists against others who are fighting against the communists. And those who are fighting against the communists, it's a weird kind of combination. Some of them are pro-monarchists, who want to return a monarchy back to Russia. Some of them are democratic socialists that just want a form of government that's a little bit more representative. The allies of World War II will even get involved in the Civil War. The United States and the British send small numbers of troops who are also going to, in effect, be fighting against the communists. In the Civil War, they kind of categorize the two forces: the communists are the Reds, and everyone fighting against them are the Whites. So Reds versus Whites. And as you can see there, the years that Civil War rages on, when it's all over, because the whites don't have this unified goal or purpose, there's all kinds of different kind of agendas going on, the Reds will be able to take advantage of that. And so the Communist Revolution basically cements its success, its power at the conclusion of that Civil War by being able to claim victory. It's kind of in a way, it's a little bit of a hollow victory because, Lenin and the Bolsheviks have won, but the country is pretty much ravaged. I mean, this is coming off of, a few years of what turns out to be a disastrous experience in World War One, and then you have 3-4 years of civil war. And the country, it has just been brutalized. There's famine breaking out, kind of like the photograph you see over there, famine breaking out in various parts of the country. And the economy is teetering right on the edge of absolute and total collapse. To fight against this, the communists under Lenin go straight to work. Lenin announces in 1921, about the same time that they're also announcing the new change to the Soviet Union, no longer Russia, the USSR. But he announces his new economic policy. And it's an interesting approach. I mean, this government sweeps in and, they're going to institute communism. And one of the first moves that Lenin makes actually allows for limited private business. And, the bottom line is he tells, the other leaders of the Soviet Union and his people that we have to kind of transition into communism. And so while we're in that transition, if you want to run your own business, you can. Okay, which really flies in the face of communism. I mean, he pretty much is kind of encouraging limited capitalism. But he's saying, hey, just to get us a step closer to where we can institute pure communism, this is something that we need to do. And the new economic policy will actually, it's going to be not like a night and day difference, but it is going to help. It's going to help to pull Russia or Soviet Union from the edge of that economic collapse. All right. And then Lenin dies. I think he ends up suffering for a few years with cancer, and in his final days can no longer speak. I think his mind is still functioning fine, but the voice is silenced. Lenin had his ideas about who should take his place, but one of his lieutenants, Joseph Stalin, you see pictured there, good old Uncle Joe, he is going to maneuver his way into power, pretty much elbow out of the way the chosen leader. A lot of what we know is that Lenin wanted one of his other top members of the communist government, Leon Trotsky, to take his place. But Stalin is he's not a very well educated guy or anything, but he's kind of like got those street smarts. And he knows how to get lots of dirty business done, and so he's able to, like I said, he's able to kind of elbow his way in, and to get himself to take control of the top leadership, what's called the Politburo of the Soviet Union. And by 1924, he has himself in position. And as soon as he has himself in position, he immediately starts to work to make himself a totalitarian dictator. When I say totalitarian, I mean, you just think of the words total, as in total power. And that is exactly where Stalin is going to take the Soviet Union, is precisely where he wants to take it now that he has full control of the government. One of the early moves that he makes is to scratch out the new economic policy. Basically, says, hey, this is, it's not communism. And so he replaces it with what he calls his 5-year plans. And this is kind of his plan to kind of a very speeded up process of industrializing the Soviet Union to finally, to catch up with the West, and, that sort of a thing. And so he very, very aggressive plans to industrialize. It will be semi-successful. Mentioned that when the Great Depression hits, these 5-year plans will be in operation, and it is going to kind of insulate the Soviet Union from the Great Depression. Also, by that point in time, the Soviet Union has been pretty well isolated from the rest of the world, either by choice or with a lot of the world turning their back on this experiment in communism. And that isolation will, to a certain extent, will protect them from some of the ill effects of the Great Depression. Along with Stalin's 5-year plans, he also kind of in the, I guess, thinking about collectivization, or kind of a little bit more some of the principles of communism. He takes over the farming industry of the Soviet Union. Collectivization is a reference to taking away land from actual landowners and putting it into the hands of what are called collectives. And so these are supposed to be these kind of community-based, farming villages. And to him, it's getting more to what communism is, kind of everything kind of being equalized. Instead, what he ends up with is kind of this kind of mini rebellion from the landowners who don't appreciate the fact that their land is being stripped from them. And you also have a lot of them who are farmers who are losing their farms because the government is taking them over. And in some cases, the farmers protest by either destroying their crops, sabotaging their crops, that sort of thing. And their actions end up triggering a famine. And estimates are all over the place, but it's estimated that maybe 10, 20 million, some estimates put it even larger than that, of the citizens of the Soviet Union are going to end up dying in this famine. One of the hardest hit parts of this famine is the part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine. And a large major agricultural part of the Soviet Union, and where you have a lot of that basically revolt against collectivization. And that will set up kind of this history that we see playing out to this very day of this friction between the Soviet, eventually Russian government and Ukraine, that sees themselves as kind of this oppressed, populace that is taken advantage of and victimized by the Soviet leadership. And so some of the conflict that we see playing out right now has some of the connections back to that history of of some bad blood between the Soviet Union, later on Russia, and Ukraine. All right, here we go. Like I said, because even it's a painful process with his 5 year plans. Um, it's a kind of a clumsy approach to it, and ends up with a lot of suffering as well. But at the end, it's successful enough to again counter a lot of the effects of the Great Depression. The flip side of that is Stalin's approach to running the Soviet Union. It is an absolute dictatorship, and there's zero dissent allowed. He sets up a gulag system in the Soviet Union. It's a prison system, and the inmates in them, most of them, it's not like they're criminals. It's not robbers and murderers and things like that. A lot of the people in the gulags are people who have spoken out against Stalin, who have shown any kind of opposition or dissent. And by setting up this gulag system, Stalin is over time able to basically just silence any potential opposition to his rule, to his leadership. That's kind of the way that he's going to run things. All right. Okay, we'll flip it back over to Mexico, which we last left them. They had their revolution. Diaz out, Madero in, although Madero doesn't last very long, ends up being assassinated. But this also establishes the PRI as the political party that's then going to run Mexico for many, 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 many years going forward. One of the first major moves the PRI makes, and this is a very controversial one, is they nationalize foreign-owned businesses in Mexico. What that means is if it's a business that's owned by a British transnational or an American, corporation, the Mexican government at this point basically tells them, pack your bags, you're out of here. You can, your factories are going to stay. All the infrastructure you've created is going to stay. We're going to keep it. We're going to use it. But we are taking over your business. All right. As a foreigner, you're gone. And that is what nationalizing is. Okay, it's kicking out the foreign-owned business interests and taking over those businesses themselves. And so obviously creates a lot of friction and anger from the countries that are being given the boot, and is going to create some problems further on down the road. But it's one of those things that Mexico sees as being necessary for their survival. That they need to be independent. They need to have control of their own economy, and as long as they have this foreign interference, they're just going to have that. They're not going to be truly independent, and so that nationalization goes forward. Um, we talked about this even back when we talked about Bolivar and some of the Latin American revolutions early in the 19th century. One of the downsides to this revolution in Mexico is it seems to have very, very little effect on society. People that were thinking that maybe this was going to provide an opportunity for the large peasant population of Mexico to maybe see a higher standard of living, a higher social status. They are going to be sadly mistaken and not going to be satisfied with the ultimate results of this. And a lot of the social hierarchy will look very much the same in Mexico as it did before the revolution even takes place. All right. So, where the PRI is trying to make some moves to move Mexico along in a positive direction, there's other aspects of society in, this kind of new Mexico that we don't see. It's more of that. It's the continuity, whereas the nationalization is the change. You kind of think of it that way if we're going to put it into our College Board kind of syntax. All right, moving it on from there is going to be this phenomenon that we're going to see rise up particularly in Europe, starting in the 1920s, and then kind of going full flame in the 1930s, leading right up to World War II. And that is the rise of another new political ideology. Okay, so we've introduced communism, and we now have a country, large country now, under the control of a communist government. And now we're going to see this other ideology, fascism, come into play. And I've got the picture over here of I think what they call a fascist, I think is how it's kind of like the first I think about 5, 6 letters of that word. And it's this old kind of symbolic, again, and it comes from Italy. The word fascist is at its core is an Italian word, and it's like this little bundle of sticks that's all bound together, and it's kind of that idea that, separate, you're just kind of this one little stick that can be easily broken, but bound together there's strength, there's power. And then they add a little blade on there because, well, as we'll learn with fascism, there's kind of some sharp edges to it. So I'm just going to run you through a real quick kind of, some of the characteristics of fascism, especially this 1920s, 1930s version that we're going to see develop. So again, ideology, form of government, extreme, what some people might even call like hyper nationalism. And so, part of it is kind of this really, really strong identity. And a lot of times in fascist countries, they're going to talk about, the purity of the blood, of the nation. And a lot of times kind of harken back to the history of, of the people of that country. Again, it kind of drifts into a little bit of kind of some patriotism, but it's that identity kind of, we've talked about nationalism already. That's going to play a strong role. And then a real obsession with military power, as far as, glorifying it, increasing it, that sort of thing. All right. The use of violence and dissent under these fascist governments. First of all, there's going to be no dissent. Okay, there's no opposition. You don't get to have another party around that says, hey, but wait a minute. Everyone is on board. Everyone is on the same page. And so no dissent, and to make sure that there is no dissent, violence. That's where that comes in. And fascist governments do tend to believe that violence is completely and totally justified to achieve goals. And that is whether that's, putting themselves into power in the first place, or then the use of violence to maintain that power. Okay. Another feature will be authoritarian dictators. So we already introduced you to Joseph Stalin. He's not using fascism, okay? But he is an example of an authoritarian or totalitarian dictator. And, when we use that word authoritarian, these are guys that want to project that strong image of, manly man, authority. And a lot of times it's almost kind of comical masculinity that they'll put on display. But I mean, they're not doing it for laughs. I mean, they believe what they're doing is, in part to kind of cast the spell over their people and lure them in, and then to also inject a certain amount of fear into their enemies and those who might oppose them, within and outside of their country. So that idea of dictator type leaders. Also, we see a strong threat amongst a lot of these fascist countries in really taking advantage of media and propaganda. Media is just kind of coming into its own in the 1920s and 30s. You're starting to get the first introduction of radio, and then motion picture. By the end of the 1920s, you have motion pictures now that it features sound. And a lot of times these fascist governments are going to be able to, they're going to manipulate this and use this in propaganda, to get kind of those messages of, hatred towards those that they, kind of use to organize themselves around, and then just building up the, kind of the aura of the leader and that kind of a thing. And I talk about, kind of that whole idea of maybe kind of victimizing, or when I talk about grievance mentality there with E, usually it's the idea of kind of having, when I say having grievances, in other words, there are these problems. And what we find with a lot of these fascist leaders is a lot of times they'll focus in on like a minority group in their country, and and especially when we're talking about Germany, and lesser amount there with Italy, but that's where they're gonna really zero in on Jewish people. They're going to represent a small religious minority in their countries, and they're going to seize on old Semitism, anti-Semitism that goes back for centuries, and slowly build up this narrative that the problems that are going on in their country are because of these people. And if these people were just gone, if they were just disappeared, so would their problems. And so it's using that to build unity, to build support, to kind of constantly always be pointing the finger and saying, these people, and then using media and propaganda to convince your population that, yeah, it is those people. It would be better if they were just gone, and and using that as a base of support. Okay, so I think, yeah, that's what we're going to see, especially in Italy and Germany. Okay, is kind of like almost using it like a playbook in terms of how this is going to play out. For all the attention that Adolf Hitler gets in kind of popular history, actually, Benito Mussolini and the story of Italy is where we see fascism make its first appearance. Hitler is going to be the one coming in a secondary role. There's Mussolini pictured there for you, a couple different versions of him. And he is a guy who gets a few little similarities to Hitler. Was in World War One as a journalist coming out of the war, but becomes politically involved, and early on comes to believe that the only thing, and Italy is another one of these countries that is going to have some struggles coming out of World War One, some fears about communism and that sort of thing, and Mussolini believes that the only answer to quote unquote saving Italy is this very very strong armed approach, and early on embraces this concept of fascism, and in a certain way kind of is the originator of some of those principles I just talked about. We kind of give him the credit, the discredit, I don't know what you want to call it, of creating a lot of this, and then we see Hitler, who kind of perfects it. Okay, I mean, because he's definitely going to eclipse Mussolini but basically the police state that Hitler's going to be able to create. Mussolini will always be a little bit of push and pull with his people, but what he's going to end up doing is pretty much just embracing fascism, and then this concept of corporatism. Okay, this is where you look at all of the different sectors of your economy. Okay, industry and that kind of thing, and I mean they're allowed to kind of operate on their own, but there's this understanding, whether it's the leaders of industry, the people who own the factories and things like that, that their first responsibility is to the nation. This comes first before we talk about them enriching themselves, and making their corporations, their businesses more successful. Their first, and that's what corporatism is. It's just kind of like, your business's first responsibility is to the nation. It's to the country itself. Okay. Mussolini is able to pretty much march his way into power, basically through to a certain extent, that kind of bluffs his way into power, gathers together what he calls they're called the black shirts, is kind of the rank and file of the fascist party in Italy, and they very famously in the early 1920s they march on Rome, and the king, they were still being run by a little bit more of a constitutional monarchy at that time, so not an all-powerful king, but they're able to intimidate the king into giving them a role in Italian government. And as soon as they get, basically their foot in the door, boom, it's all over. They take over. And so, yes, Mussolini is going to create a totalitarian state. And so the idea where, the government is going to control pretty much all aspects of society, Lots of propaganda. Some of the examples you see around there, all the pictures of Mussolini always looking all, all that. Pictures like this one where it's like a gigantic, this is like the side of a building in downtown Rome. And it's like this big, weird hovering head of Mussolini. And then the word C repeated behind it, which Italian, it's yes, yes, yes. It's kind of like, and it's not quite subliminal because it's a little more obvious than that. But anyhow, saluting the Duce. That was his nickname. The leader, Il Duce, was Mussolini. And so that's where you get that. And um, he will also not. I mean, not immediately, but by the time he gets into the early to mid 1930s, he's going to start to kind of feel a little kind of almost wanting to harken back to the old Roman Empire, and so start with some foreign kind of adventures. Um, he will marches. Hold on just a second. I'm gonna sneeze. I think. Sorry. That. Um, Anyhow, where was I? Oh, Abyssinia. African country, well, now known as Ethiopia. He launches an invasion of this country in 1935, pretty much just to kind of, I don't know, basically to try to kind of like show off to the world that, hey, Italy's back, and we're gonna, in a way, it's kind of like we're gonna start creating our very kind of post imperialism, but really this is kind of imperialism, to take over Abyssinia and make it almost like a colony. Except at this point we're talking after World War One, and this is really looked down upon, and the League of Nations steps in and threatens Italy, and Mussolini pretty much threatens the League of Nations back. Nothing comes of it, and it's yet another sign. Not that I've really been talking about this, but there have been a number of challenges since the end of World War One, where the League of Nations has been shown to be a pretty toothless organization. One of the reasons because of that, or for that, is that the United States never joins the League of Nations. Um, Woodrow Wilson, when he comes back in 1919, has to sell the Treaty of Versailles to the U.S. Congress for approval, and they do end up approving it. But when it comes to the League of Nations, Americans are a little bit soured by their experience in World War One, and don't want the possibility of being dragged into another war, and so Congress does not give the approval for the U.S. to join the League, and so we're never in it. Okay, it's a whole bunch of other countries, but really, there's no really strong leadership in the League, and then by 1935, the Great Depression is just really distracting countries. Countries are kind of trying to take care of themselves, and Italy is kind of able to, somewhat take advantage of that with this invasion. As like I said, Mussolini trying to put Italy back on the map. And then the next year, Mussolini creates an official alliance with Nazi Germany. 1936. By then, Hitler's been in power for several years, and so you have the beginnings of what will come to be known as the Axis powers in World War II. All right, I'm going to cover one more topic with you, and then we'll hit the brakes here, and that is what some historians refer to as kind of the dress rehearsal for World War II civil war that breaks out in Spain in the 1930s, 1936 to be specific, and you end up with a war that is made up of what's called the Popular Front, and nationalists. The nationalists are led by a guy by the name of Francisco Franco, and he's kind of lines up a little bit more as a fascist. Some people kind of look at this war as the Popular Front being a little bit more politically to the left, and the nationalists being more politically to the right. And I guess as an example of that, and I think I'll jump into this here next, right? Yeah, there we go. You'll have a bunch of countries that will jump into this war to kind of help these two sides out. We have a lot of kind of like proxy war going on. Germany and Italy are going to back up the nationalists, and so Franco and the nationalists, yeah, are going to have the support of two fascist nations. The Soviet Union, whose politics, I mean, quite frankly, when you get to it, are more to the left as communism. They're going to produce some supporting of the Popular Front, and then the British and the French, and in a very very unofficial way, there'll even be some Americans who travel as private citizens over to Spain to fight on the side of the Popular Front as well. And so are going to have all kinds of foreign kind of I'm not going to I don't know if I'm going to call interference. Well, involvement, I guess, is the better word. One of the significant events of the Civil War in Spain is the German bombing of the city of Guernica. Um, this is basically Germany practicing for World War II. By this point in time, and again, we're going to jumping back and forth on this. We'll look at it a little more closely when we look at Nazi Germany. But by this point in time, the Germans have just defied the Treaty of Versailles and have started rebuilding their military and are basically taking a stance of, if you want to do something about it, do something about it. But again, it's 1936. We're in the heart of the Great Depression, and no one does anything about it. And so, again, the dress rehearsal I referred to, and the bombing of Guernica is kind of a foreshadowing of the massive bombing that will end up going on really from all sides involved in World War II. That'll break out here in just a few short years. When it's all said and done, the support of the fascists is going to outweigh the support from others trying to help out the Popular Front, and Franco and the Nationalists will win in 1939. Franco will be installed as dictator with some of that help from the Italians and the Germans, and Franco will rule Spain for the next trying to think here, about 30 something years. I think it's all the way into the early 70s before he finally dies. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and hit the brakes there. Being we're at 36 minutes by my clock. We still have a few other little topics here that we need to hit before we actually even jump into the rise of Hitler. And once we cover that, we're going to be just driving straight on into the beginnings of World War II and right on into World War II. But still quite a bit to cover. All right, so I'll give you this to finish off this week, and we will be right back into it next week. All right, till then, see ya.